But I mean, they took an average of 135 kilograms of gunpowder each on average through the Great Trek. They took cannons with them. The guys knew they were leaving the Cape, they're never coming back kind of attitude. And so who cared what the British government said? And the 1820 settlers were helping them to break the law of the British government, because the 1820 settlers knew how the British government had betrayed them as well. And there was a real camaraderie between the 1820 settlers and the fur trekkers. And there was a real appreciation for one another. The 1820 settlers had come in, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, they'd fought Napoleon, they'd fought for Britain, and then the British government said they were giving them the reward of giving them land, farms in Africa. They were all very happy until they found out they were being put right on a hostile, hot frontier, which was just full of raids and attacks, and they thought they were coming to a peaceful farm retirement, and here they were being put there. I mean, the British government really cheated and tricked them, and they just plonked them in a place where else could they go? And this is part of the British government's way of defending the frontier, to take these retired soldiers and stick them on their frontier where they'd be forced to fight, to defend the frontier whether they wanted to or not, but now they're not getting paid. And they put them in absolutely worthless land. The Eastern Cape was not in any sense cultivated when they arrived, and these poor men just had to, as I said, we had to take root and live or die where we stood. And so when the fur trekkers left, they'd entrusted them with a beautiful Bible, which is actually on display at the 1820 settlers it's spoken of at the 1820 settlers monument. It's on display at the fur trekker monument, where they said that God has put us at the foot of Africa to take the gospel throughout Africa. And there was this common vision of both the 1820 settlers and the fur trekkers that they had a missionary calling. Well, 2 hours before dawn, the trekkers were called to their posts, and they waited in silence, and there was a thin veil of mist, and then as the sun rose, the veil of mist lifted, and a perfect day broke, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was vivid blue sky. There was no wind. It was described by the trekkers as a day of the most crystal clarity. And as the mist lifted, the Boers saw the entire Zulu army seated in front of them with their shields in front. The front row of Zulus was only 40 paces in front of them, and the back was at least 1,000 paces back, and they were just tightly wedged in. There's just tens of thousands out there, row after row of Zulu regiments grouped according to the colour of their shields. There were between 12,000 and 15,000 Zulus surrounding the laager, it was estimated. "Do not fear their numbers, we can deal with them," shouted Pretorius. And as the warriors were moving into position to attack the Donga from the rear, Commandant Pretorius decided to seize the initiative, and he ordered his men to open fire immediately. Before the Zulus could even begin the intimidating war dances, the roar of gunfire shattered the early morning peace. And this is the disposition of the forces. You can see the laager, in fact, more anchored here than the other pictures are depicted. The Zulus pouring in, coming in from the north primarily, but also coming from the sides. And a surprise attack by one of the king's brothers, half brothers, seeking to attack up from the Donga from behind, and the rear section was being administered by Cyril Cilliers, the chaplain. The day began in furious battle, with Zulus yelling, hissing, smashing the ascars against the shields, thunderously stamping the ground with their feet, charging the laager at full speed. The two little cannon cut swathes through the Zulu ranks, and the deadly aim of the Boer commandos took their toll. As the massive Zulus tried to scale the Donga and assault the rear of the laager, Cyril Cilliers led his men to cut them down. And the Zulus had never experienced anything like it. They retreated out of range to about 500 meters. So Pretorius sent out his brother with an interpreter who spoke Zulu to taunt the Zulus. The interpreter was actually an Englishman who learned Zulu at Port Natal. And he said, "What are you doing, men of Dingaan? We have come to fight men, not women and children. Why don't you attack?" And then they faced the most intense Zulu tidal wave of the battle. The Zulus leapt up to attack, drumming their shields, yelling, whistling, hissing. They swept down a black wave down the wagons, and this was the longest charge of the 2-hour battle. The muzzles were becoming so dangerously hot that they feared just the gunpowder to explode as they poured it in. But the strategic positioning of the laager was frustrating the assaults of the Zulus. The closer they got to the wagons, the more they were funneled and compressed by the river and the Donga, till they were tripping into one another, stumbling over the earlier casualties. Their losses were becoming absolutely enormous, yet without achieving a thing. Never in experience of their warrior nation had anything like this ever happened to them before. And there was a point in the battle when Andries Pretorius sensed a change in the tempo, and he ordered a charge from the laager, and he had the two cannon dragged out and fired from the front, and then he led a charge into the middle of the Zulu impi in the area which had been cleared by the cannon. For the first time in history, a Zulu impi broke and fled, and the cohesion on which the Zulu impis was based was shattered. The Zulus began to flee across the Nkom River, many drowning in the process. As Pretorius fired on one Zulu, his horse reared and threw him off. This was a borrowed horse. in the excitement he had not taken his own horse. And he fell to the ground, and a Zulu lunged at him, and Pretorius managed to ward off the Ascar with his rifle, and as the Zulu struck him again, he was thrust through his left hand, and then he pinned the Zulu to the ground, grappled hand-to-hand, until the warrior was stabbed to death with his own assegai. That's how one of the wounds was incurred. On the other side, Sarel Cilliers led a commando charge that put to flight the other section of the Zulu army. He looks like a very serious kind of chaplain there, but apparently he was in the thick of the fighting, both at Vechtkorp and at Blood River. Imagine having taken part in two of the most important battles at that time. The mounted Boers pursued the fleeing Zulus, shooting at them as long as their bullets lasted, and firing pebbles when all of their bullets were exhausted. They literally were just throwing pebbles down the barrels because they'd run out of bullets. Another 3,000 Zulu dead were counted around the laager after the battle, yet not one Voortrekker had been killed, even though several were wounded. This is the Trekkers organ that they set up in the church in Pietermaritzburg in just 1840, shortly after that. As the sun set, the exhausted commando members returned for a service of Thanksgiving, and for their first meal of the day they hadn't had a chance to have a bite to eat, not so much a rusk. It had been such a day from the time the sun had risen. They were just fighting the whole day, and this was the first time they had a chance to have a meal that whole day. Then they had to clean their muskets, cast bullets for the final push to track down Dingaan, and Global. They'd used so many bullets that exhausted their entire supply, and now they had to prepare for the next battle. And this is the actual site of the massacre of Piet Retief, the monument, the burial site below. On the 20th of December, the Zulu capital was sighted. It was ablaze from one side to the other. Dingaan had fled, and he had set fire to his own capital. And when the grisly remains of Piet Retief and his 100 followers was discovered at KwaMatawani, they saw the legs and arms still tied with thongs, the impaling stick still visible. Next to the remains of Piet Retief lay his water bottle and his leather satchel, which still contained Dingaan's signed and witnessed agreement for the cessation of Natal, which he'd put so much trust in. On Christmas Day, the remains of all these victims were gathered and buried in a communal grave at the foot of the kopje. And today they've got that monument with the names of the victims on there. Now the Zulu kingdom fell into civil war, and Dingaan was overthrown by his half-brother Mpande, the only brother he had neglected to kill. Mpande had spent his whole life groveling and pretending to be subservient to Dingaan, but now was the time for him to come to the fore, and Mpande, who was the politician survivor, managed to have Dingaan overthrown, and then he was crowned at an event where Pretorius and many of the Boers were present, and they with Englishmen from Port Natal agreed to the enthronement of Mpande, and from then there was peace. Well, that's not the end of the story. It's remarkable that despite the treachery that the Boers had endured at the hands of the Zulu, and the massacres of so many unsuspecting women and children on the banks of the Blowkrans River, that no atrocities were committed by the Boers in retaliation. This is unlike what the Canadians or the Australians or the Americans did to Indians who had, and Aborigines who had done atrocities to their people. And there's some serious massacres that went on there. But there's no case in South African history of the Boers going on a rampage and just killing black women and children. Despite the fiction, there's not one incident that they can point to that ever happened. Just
but also know the same can be said for the Anglo-Boer War.
Also interesting. Although many atrocities done against the Boers, they did not do similar atrocities to the English women and children, who they could have done. They could have reached them because the Boer commanders came within sight of Table Mountain. They were rampaging all throughout the Cape, and they could have had many opportunities for similar kinds of atrocities. But a good point. So plainly there was a Christian core to these people, that even if not everyone had a personal relationship with Christ, there was the fear of God, that they had something that kept them from. Revenge would have been understandable, but they didn't take revenge. That's a remarkable thing.